Dominant firms, successful firms, actually have a lot going for them when it comes to innovation. They can introduce more radical product innovations, and I've found evidence that they do. More importantly, when they introduce something radical, they can capture a lot of value from it because they have all these other assets, brands, sales force, all these kinds of things. So resources do matter. Having resources do matter, and that favors large companies. But nevertheless, as we discussed, large companies do have all these mindset and organizational challenges that they face. Maybe lack of curiosity, lack of imagination, commitment to the current rather than the future. Innovation is sort of like playing in a garden of contradictions or paradoxes, things that are pulling you in different directions. And Melissa talked at length about this earlier. You know, for instance, you're trying to operate in the present with your current products and your current competitors. At the same time, you're trying to preempt the future and do something different. So that's really hard to do. I often think about it as, you know, trying to write with your left hand and the right hand at the same time in two different scripts. Organizations need to be ambidextrous to do this, and that's really hard. Think about the bricks and mortar booksellers who also tried to do online and failed because they didn't do either of them very well. That's a big challenge. You've got to develop core competencies, but they cannot become rigidities. You've got to have silos, but they can't work independently of each other. They've got to work together. You've got to have some continuity, yet you've got to change. You've got to have some standard processes, but from time to time, you need to have a bit of creative chaos. You've got to let people do wild things like Ford is doing in Tech Shop. You've got to have functional expertise, but those people have got to talk to each other. The technical people have to talk to the marketing people. They have to talk to the operations people, and so forth. You've got to diversify and grow, yet you've got to stay focused and lean. So how do you do this? How do organizations manage these contradictions? I argue that they do that by creating a culture of innovation, by creating certain attitudes and practices deep within the organization that deal with these contradictions. So let me just shift gears a bit and ask you this question. Any guesses? Just throw out any name, doesn't matter. IBM. Everybody answers IBM. It's not IBM. The answer will surprise you a bit. Xerox. Xerox, in the 1970s, in their Palo Alto Research Center, or PARC, invented all these things. Look at that list. All these things were invented in one place by one company. They wanted to create the office of the future, the paperless office, because they were worried what will happen when people stare at the screen rather than printing out paper. What will happen to Xerox's copying business? So they decided to preempt that themselves by inventing all these things. All kinds of people have looked at this question from different angles. You know, so, I mean, I suppose every one of us has a view. If you ask the man or woman in the street, they might say, oh yeah, Americans are very innovative, or Japanese are really good at technology, or something like that. And of course, sociologists like Max Weber would say, oh yeah, it's because of their religious beliefs, you know, Calvinist ethic and all that. Social psychologists like Hofstadter will say, yeah, it's a little more complicated than that. You know, it's, you have attitudes within countries. You have cultures that are more hierarchical, so they're not good for innovation. You have some which are more individualistic, so that's good for innovation. Geographers will say, no, the only thing that matters is how far you're from the equator, and the further, the better. And the logic being that when you're in really cold places, you have to think about the future. And planning for the future is an important aspect of innovation. Legal scholars say it's about intellectual property. If you protect the rewards to the effort, then you'll see more effort, and you'll see more innovation. Economists say it's all about spending. The more you spend on technology or on personnel, on education, the more you'll get out. In business schools, there's been a whole lot of literature on what happens within companies, internal culture driving innovation. So we wanted to test all these things, and so we did a massive survey. It's the largest of its kind. We surveyed over 4,000 companies from over 17 countries. We found that that culture of innovation was the biggest driver of radical innovation and the value that they captured, followed by spending. So spending was important, but the culture was much more important. And what was this culture all about? We found 3 attitudes and 3 practices were the biggest drivers of innovation. The most innovative companies in our sample were ones that spent some time thinking about the future. They didn't just think about their current customers, their current products, the current technology. They also thought about future customers, future markets, future technologies. Now, if you do that, you could imagine, if you're thinking about the future, you're more likely to have new ideas and come up with maybe prototypes. But will you commercialize them? In order to commercialize those ideas, you've got to be willing to cannibalize your current products or services. And this starts to get hard. You're essentially gambling on an uncertain thing versus a sure established thing. Think about Kodak and digital photography. The Brownie came out in 1900. They dominated the photographic industry on the photographic film technology for 80 or 90 years. They actually had one of the first patents on digital photography as early as 1972. But they found it really hard to back digital photography over a sure thing, photographic film. So willingness to cannibalize is important. But doing that involves taking some risk. So you've got to also be willing to take some risk within the organization, and that's hard. So what practices can you adopt to support these attitudes? Well, Melissa mentioned one. Importantly, product champions, having people within the organization at different levels who are empowered to either identify new ideas, bring them into the organization, a bit like P&G, or take them forward to commercialization. You have to empower people to do that. You can use incentives. Now, this is very interesting, because what do you do with success? If somebody's successful, what should you do as a company? Pardon? Try and replicate that. And what do you say to the person who innovated? What do you say to them? Recognize it in some way. It doesn't have to be financial. It can just be recognition. That can matter. Now, what do you do with failure? What if they tried something and failed? Recognize it. What do you think companies actually do? They cover it up, punish it explicitly or implicitly. It's a taboo. You don't want to fail. You don't want to admit failure. This is a huge issue. So you've got to reward success, but you've got to find a way to destigmatize failure. You've got to bring it out in the open so you can learn from it, and that's tricky. So a lot of these things are tricky. They're not easy to do. People know about them, but how to do it is a different matter. Finally, internal markets. So we talked about this problem, this paradox of the big, successful company actually finding it hard to do it again. And partly it's the lack of curiosity and so on. But also it's an organizational problem. That's where the inertia comes in. You become big, you become slow, you become complacent. The processes get in the way of doing new stuff. So how do you shake that up? One way to do that is to create an internal market. You have divisions that have some autonomy and can compete with each other up to a point. Maybe we could take a few minutes to look at that sheet of paper you have in front of you, which is an extract from the big survey we sent out. And really what it does is those are some of the items that we used in our survey to measure a culture of innovation within an organization. And so perhaps you could glance over this and ask yourself those questions there. In terms of your organization, how do you think you do on each of those 12 things, those 12 items? Take a few minutes, see if you can address those questions. This can be a very useful tool in any organization. I've done this exercise with many large companies from across sectors, and you get fascinating insights. You get all kinds of things happening. In a particular organization, people could answer very differently the same question. And so it's interesting why they would have those different views, and you can discuss those. In the same company, you could find that people think they do well on some of them. So you can ask the question, why are we doing well on those things? What can we continue doing? And they might find they do badly on others. For instance, incentives. I'm amazed to find how many large companies really score themselves poorly on incentives. Even recognition of success, not to mention how they deal with failure. So you can have a discussion about what can we do better to recognize people. Not necessarily pay them more, because sometimes financial incentives can be counterproductive. But how can we recognize people more? And how can we deal with failure? You could have a very interesting discussion around that. So think about this tool as an interesting diagnostic. It's a very simple diagnostic. You can have more complex ones. But I found that even this simple thing does a lot to start a conversation and then to discover what's going well in the organization, but what can be done better. Let me talk about some of these attitudes and practices I discussed and tell you what happened at other companies. So this is an easy question. I think everybody knows the answer. Sony, everybody knows the answer. The important or difficult question is, why didn't Sony introduce the iPod and iTunes? Maybe call it something else, but the same thing. They had MP3 technology. They had music assets. They had brands that had done similar things before, Walkman and Discman. So the question is, why didn't Sony introduce the iPod and iTunes? And the answer is not because they didn't have the resources. They had the resources. The answer is a mindset and an organizational issue. They had silos that didn't want to work and talk to each other. They had the music assets division in particular that didn't want to be cannibalized by the consumer electronics division. And so they didn't introduce it. Apple introduced it, and we saw what happened to Apple's performance. Of course, Apple at that time didn't have this problem of willingness to cannibalize or unwillingness to cannibalize because they didn't have anything to cannibalize. They weren't doing very well, actually. This was one of the few products that actually got them going. But then think about what Apple did subsequently. So they milked that. That was a radical innovation in a way, the iPod, iTunes. But they milked it with lots of incremental innovations. They got all the value from it, and then what did they do? They introduced another radical innovation. They introduced the iPhone. And they milked that with incremental innovation. And even though the iPhone cannibalized the iPod, that's fine because they captured value from it. And then they introduced the iPad. And they did this again. That's quite remarkable in a 10-year period to come up with a radical innovation that cannibalizes your existing product, milk it, and then do it again. And of course, I gave you the example of Gillette doing that as a matter of course. Even if it meant cannibalizing themselves, they do that as a way to stay ahead of competition. And it's deeply ingrained in the organization. Risk. What about risk? There are some sectors where risk is just the price, or taking on risk is the price of doing business. Think of pharmaceuticals. CEO of Amgen says, innovation means willingness to bet hundreds of millions of dollars in a new drug, labor for over a decade, it might fail, and we have to try all over again. So in some cases, you simply have to be willing to take risk and fail and then get up and start again, because that's the price of doing business in these industries. But across sectors, really, what you're trying to do is to create this mindset of curiosity and so forth, where people are comfortable with the uncomfortable, with change. They've got to be willing to look for ideas from other markets, other geographies, other sectors, and be willing to bring them in, even if it's disruptive, up to a point, of course. But you've got to challenge orthodoxy. This is a point that Melissa was also making. And that brings us to product champions. And there's a very interesting tension here, which links again to the point about middle management, about do you do it top-down, like Xerox did it, or do you bottom-up, like a lot of companies like Google increasingly do it? And you've got to do both. There are benefits to each. If you start with the top, the CEO says something that galvanizes resources and people. But the CEO could be wrong if you rely on one person. Or what happens if the CEO dies, as in Xerox, or moves on? What happens to Apple now? Things like that. So you want to diversify the risk, and you want to involve more people in the organization. You want to go all the way down, particularly in the middle levels. So that has implications for structure, and it has implications for attitudes within the organization. You want people who are watch builders, not time tellers, because innovation doesn't work this way. You know? So it's a creative exercise. You need a bit of chaos, and you need to engage people. The more people you engage, the better. Incentives. We talked about incentives. So you've got to reward success, and it doesn't have to be financial. Just can be recognition. You've got to tolerate failure. You've got to destigmatize it. You've got to find a way to encourage people to take a bit of risk, because innovation is risky. It involves experimentation and trial and error and learning. Internal markets. So here's what you do. You have some internal autonomy and some internal competition. Examples. Hewlett and Packard, big organization, constantly coming up with new ideas. A lot of them sitting on the shelf. How do we commercialize these ideas? So they say, okay, we have a division in Boise, Idaho. It's the biggest one. So if somebody within Hewlett Packard has an idea for some new kind of printer, they can go to the Boise, Idaho division. Now, for whatever reason, complacence or lack of imagination or whatever, they say no. This person can then take their idea to the division in San Diego. which is a smaller division, a bit hungrier, they might want to take this on. And if they say no, they can go to the Portland division. So there's some options within the company. IBM does something similar, except that the division that commercializes it needs to get the consensus of the division that will be cannibalized. Now, of course, that slows things down. However, that ensures you don't have negative competition. So you've got to think about some of the negative aspects of having too much competition. And you've got to think about what is the ethos of your company. So a lot of these attitudes and practices need to be, shall we say, adapted to your company's dominant traditions and culture. So let me just conclude this section by saying that resources are important, but they're not enough. Much more important is a culture that converts ideas into products. And that means thinking differently, so thinking more about the future, acting differently, cannibalizing your current success and taking on risk, and organizing differently, using product champions, incentives, and internal markets. So often people look to the top person when it comes to innovation. Of course, the top person has a role to play. But the top person can be wrong. Think of Anne Wang, who said, the PC is the stupidest thing I ever heard of. He was the guy behind the word processor, so he was successful once, but he failed to repeat it. These are things you can take away. Innovation is critical. I think many of you agree. But it isn't easy. Everybody wants to do it, but it's hard, particularly for successful, established organizations. But creating and fostering a culture of innovation can help. And there are a number of ways you can do that. You need to think differently, act differently, organize differently. And in terms of you going back into your organizations, you can drive this process, but you'll be required to be visionaries of some sort, thinking about the future, imagining the future. You'll have to take risk a bit because innovation is about experimenting, trying, even failing, and then learning, doing it again. You'll have to take other people with you. You won't be able to do this on your own. You have to take other people and create a community, internal and external. And you have to be champions, whether of technical ideas, market ideas, or organizational ideas. And if you do that, you'll be innovative, and people will thank you for innovating. Thank you.